This week on the Andrew Yang podcast.
We are conflicted against our own impulse to make government work, right? That we are simultaneously eager to build out this institution so that it can solve big problems like climate change, and dreadfully fearful that powerful officials will do things that we personally don't like. And that sort of puts us in this strange position where we're selling refrigerators that don't keep the food cold. If we're going to fix these problems, government needs to work, and that's something that we as progressives need to grapple with ourselves.
It is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast fellow at Brown University, great school, Watson Institute for International Public Affairs, and the author of the brand new book that explains a whole lot about a lot of things: Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back. Marc Dunkelman. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
It is great because this book is great. Not your first book. You wrote a book about, I think, the vanishing neighborliness of Americans. You've been in politics for quite some time. You worked on Capitol Hill, and that's one reason why I enjoyed your book so much, is that it had the wisdom of a battle-hardened veteran who had been in the room trying to get big things done. So first, give people a sense of your background.
So I graduated from college, moved down to D.C., spent a whole lot of time bouncing around different Democratic offices on the Hill, worked for Joe Biden for a little while, various think tanks in D.C., decided about a decade ago that I did not want to live the D.C. life. So on a whim, my wife and I, my wife was pregnant with our second child, decided to move to Providence, and I've been writing now for about 10 years. I write for myself, I write for other people. But my thinking has always been that being in the sort of the whirl of politics in DC almost stilts your sense of what's actually happening. You're so caught in the whirlwind of, we've got to get this bill done or this budget cycle or whatever it is, and it's hard to see the larger picture. So I think moving to Rhode Island and having, I go to DC a bunch, but it's given me sort of the sense of what are non-DC insiders talking about when they see politics? How do they interpret things? And having sort of one foot in both worlds has given me a perspective that I'm not sure I would have had otherwise.
Yeah, DC is definitely a bubble. You worked on Capitol Hill, I believe, in both House and Senate offices and at a DC think tank. So you're definitely a former swamp creature, if not a current swamp creature. I don't know if you ever turn in the credential at a certain point. Is there a duration at which you lose swamp creature status?
No. I mean, I appreciate you saying swamp creature because the Rye reference. I think that a lot of those people are trying to do their best, and there's a lot of wisdom there. I wouldn't give up those years for anything. I think, I would definitely recommend to your young listeners, spend some time down there, figure out what it's like, and then come outside, because there are advantages and disadvantages both to being in DC and outside. And I think to your point, there is this chasm between what ordinary people think about government and what it feels like to be in the maw of it. And so I don't know if you ever give up the card. Hopefully I'd never give up the wisdom of having spent some time, sort of traveling, on those streets and talking to those people, because I do think it's just very different from the way I'll bet you a lot of your listeners who have not done that understand the world. I think it's its own perspective.
I have been in DC, and I agree that spending time there is super valuable to give you a sense of how things may or may not get done. So you make a very, very intelligent, timely, nuanced argument in this book that has three parts. And let's see if I get these three parts mainly correct. All right. So when people think of progressivism, they tend to think of a political alignment that's toward the far left, or they think of a century-old popular movement that originated various progressive, in quotes, policies, like, let's say, Social Security might be a big example. A lot of the products of the New Deal, and so there was a lot of stuff that came up from that time. But what you argue is in three parts that progressivism actually has two main schools of thought embodied by, let's say, Alexander Hamilton on one side and Thomas Jefferson on the other, where the Hamiltonian impulse is, hey, you need government to get its act together to be powerful enough to, for example, bring together a financial system, which was Hamilton's jam. And then the Jeffersonian impulse is, hey, government can't be trusted. If you can keep it in, it's going to do something that's not in the interest of the people. And so if you can find ways to hem it in, cordon off its power, maybe restrain it, then that's a good thing. So you have Hamiltonian progressivism on one side and then Jeffersonian on the other. So that's part one. Part two is that these two conflicting trains of progressivism have kind of been in tension and waxed and waned relative to each other over the last 100 years, let's say. And then the third part of your argument is that at this point, that this tension has become a massive political liability for quote unquote progressivism, because when you say, hey, we're going to do something and let's use something very concrete, like my friend Bernie Sanders might say, it's like, hey, let's give everyone health insurance. And then there's like this real, like, do you really trust the government to be able to do that sort of thing?
Exactly right.
And the mistrust in government has held us back from actually doing real things. And you have some concrete examples in there. So when someone says the word progressive, what are they talking about?
So, this was actually one of the big problems writing the book, is that these ideas, one, the Hamiltonian impulse to pull power up so that you can do big things, and the other, the Jeffersonian impulse to push power down because we don't want coercive institutions doing bad things to individuals. Like, the terminology here is not great, because sometimes progressivism has been a term exactly like today. The Congressional Progressive Caucus is really just the left, the furthest left wing of the Democratic Party. There have been times where the progressive idea, as was originally defined, spanned both parties, and in fact may have pulled more from the Republican Party. Like Theodore Roosevelt was the first progressive candidate for president. The thing that I'm trying to get at here is that you are a progressive if you're not a conservative. Meaning, if you think that the abiding interest in American politics is that we should have less government, like that's your view, you're not a progressive. If, on the other hand, you think that government can and should be used in proper measure to solve big problems, and we ought to be thinking about what is the right combination of private markets, public institutions, regulation, individual right. If that's your frame of mind, I'm calling you a progressive. So that means that people way on the way left, but also a lot of people who are probably moderate Republicans, certainly never Trump Republicans, maybe even some Trumpers, could be in this fold and have sort of some sense like, I just want government to work. If you and I were to have coffee at some point, and you were to say to me, like, I'm traveling to some country in South America or Asia or Europe, and what is the, what's the political dynamic there? And I were to say to you, well, there's a center left party and a center right party. We would have a notion, you and I, of what that meant. Like, the center right party would be the party of private enterprise, the center left party would be the party of government. In my book, I'm talking about people who have a notion in their minds that government has some important role to play, and I think that's a complicated demographic to define. It's not exactly Democrats. It's not exactly liberals. It's not exactly right. I'm trying to be as inclusive as possible. And that group has changed and waxed and waned through the decades. And what that group thinks has changed and waxed and waned through the decades. So I'm trying to be a little elusive there in the book in defining progressivism, because I do think it's changed. But I do think there's a certain thread that extends from, passage of the Interstate Commerce Act in, I think it's 1887, through today. So, right, like you're looking at nearly 150 years of a movement, quote unquote, and trying to understand how that fits together and how that evolves through the decades.
Thank you, listeners. Please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, send them to mailbag@andrewyang.com, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you. I have sat with very conservative, I'm sure Republican voters in Iowa who were farmers. We're going to vote for Trump. And then if I were to say to them, hey, do you think the drug companies are screwing over the people? They'd be like, yes. Are you for restrictions on those drug companies screwing people over? Yes. That's something that you would need government to do, because obviously the drug companies aren't going to just show up and be like, hey, guys, like, we're going to stop doing the things you don't like. It's super unfortunate in my mind that things have kind of gotten placed on this ideological spectrum, because the way you're defining is like, hey, do you think government should try and solve some problems? I mean, there are a lot of very conservative people who are very open to the government solving problems around, for another example, would be big tech. I sat with the same farmer and be like, hey, what do you think of the big tech companies? Be like, oh, hate them. Gotta hem them in, And so it's like, well, who's going to do that? I mean, in theory,
yeah,
the government. So I got the sense that your audience was Democrats and progressives who wanted good things, which, by the way, also maps to a lot of the book buying public, which is fine. that there was like a desire to try and explain things to self-identified progressives, saying, look, the enemy is not just conservatives or the other side. The enemy is these factions within the Democratic Party who have these contrarian impulses, and it's not necessarily different people's fault. One example you used in the book that I enjoyed, that kind of talked about sort of both the coming together and then the rein in the federal government, was the development of the airline industry, which I thought was very apt. So you start out with a bunch of crazy cowboy type airline operators, and everyone's scared to fly, and you don't know what's going on.
Totally. Yep.
And then the federal government had to, step in. So go ahead and walk people through kind of the waxing and waning of the government's role.
Yeah, I mean, so the airline industry is very, very immature in the early 30s, and like the fear is that if you start an airline, if you invest that money to start an airline, at any point one of your competitors would come in and undercut your line. Like, right, if you're going to start flying from Denver to Chicago, and like that costs a certain amount of money, but there's another airline and they decide to come in and fly that same route, like you're going to be bankrupt in a second with an airplane and not know what to do with it. So the federal government under Roosevelt establishes something called the Civil Aeronautics Board, and their role is to regularize this, to make it so that if you invest the money required to purchase an airplane and hire a crew and do all the things necessary to start an airline, which is a fairly capital-intensive endeavor, like you're going to know that you're going to get some return because they're going to protect you from just like a new splurge of competition. And so this Civil Aeronautics Board is created by the New Deal. It's a progressive idea, and it works, right? Like we do develop an airline industry that is like big enough and safe enough, and et cetera, et cetera. And like it grows over the course of the next several decades until you've got a bunch of they call them trunk line airlines that are like you can get almost anywhere in the country to another place, and they regulate prices so that people are not, you're neither gouge, nor is competition used in like an in a monopolistic way, so that you're undercutting the competition to eliminate it, right? So it's to regularize the whole thing. But then you get to like the 70s, and like you've got this weird thing where like this big government institution appears to be captured by the airline industry itself. And so it's the airliners, it's like the airline executives who like the cab, they like the regulation because it is preventing new upstart competition against them. and the public is paying a price. So there's this fight to deregulate the airline industry, and the political people associate this now with Reagan. Like deregulation is a Reagan era thing, but it was like Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter competing to be the more deregulatory Democrat. They were joined by two groups in support of them. One was the people that you would expect, the libertarians who believe government is the the evil of all evils that you would associate with Reagan, right? Like that, like this is the Chicago School of economics that is really very skeptical about government intervention, but also by Ralph Nader, like the far left, which is like this is a captured government institution working on the behest of these huge corporate elites. But it's hard to place in the current context of the way that we think of progressivism and conservatism, because it was the progressives who wanted to put guardrails around government, right? Like to dismantle this government institution, the Civil Aeronautics Board, and it was the corporate elite and like the old school that wanted to maintain it. And so just here is we on the left don't think about this much. We don't like to talk about it because it doesn't fit our existing mold of understanding the left is wanting more government and the right is wanting less. Like here is a situation where and this implies all sorts of different realms. Yeah. We on the left were really skeptical of government power and wanted to shave it down. And people can have honest conversations about what the impacts were, whether it was good or bad, or whether we should have found a different way to regulate airlines other than dismantling the Civil Aeronautics Board entirely, which is what Carter and Ted Kennedy did sort of in cahoots and almost in competition with each other, right? This is before Kennedy challenges Carter for the Democratic nomination in 1980. But you're right to pick up on this example because you're pulling back a layer of policymaking, so sort of the brain dead notion that we are for government and they are for private corporations is exposed here. It's like it's a much more complicated story, that we are ourselves intellectually divided about who should actually get to make decisions.
Yeah, I love the airline industry example too, because people can understand it. And it's like, yeah, you would need more government to help the industry mature to a point where everyone's feeling perfectly safe getting on a plane and their routes to Iowa City and wherever the heck and the rest of it. And then people then look at it decades later and say, oh, this is corporate power, too concentrated. And then it's anti-consumer. And then they turn against it. This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. I've been on a quest for the perfect mattress for my entire adult life. Why? Well, you do it 8 hours a day. I like to be active. My back sometimes acts up. So I wanted a firm mattress that offered me support, that did not overheat. I took the Helix Sleep quiz and got matched with a Dawn firm mattress. And it's been a game changer. It's been awesome. I have not had a single issue. And I got to say, people have come up to me and said, hey, I ordered a Helix Sleep mattress and it's all been rave reviews, not a single issue. It's been an awesome partnership. And the biggest partnership is that I lie down on the freaking mattress every night and I wake up refreshed and ready to go. Don't take my word for it. Go to helixsleep.com and check it out for yourself. And if you order a mattress, you can always return it without any issue because they have that much confidence in the product. Go to helixsleep.com/yang for a President's Day sale of 27% off site-wide. That's helixsleep.com/yang for 27% off site-wide. helixsleep.com/yang. One of the interesting parallels to me was, let's say, social media as an example.
Yeah.
You kind of skipped the entire government figuring it out and helping it mature phase. You're just like, you just let them do whatever. And then now data is coming out about how it's not so good for the mental health of teenage girls in particular. And then, but now the social media giants are so powerful. They're just like, like nothing to see here. I mean, you kind of skipped like the good part of the government being involved. You kind of sort of skipped toward the end. So I had Yoni Applebaum on the podcast a couple of weeks ago talking about his book Stuck, which now I think is getting included with your book Why Nothing Works as like an explainer. I thought that there were some similar ideas for sure. And you use the word vetocracy, which I quite enjoy. So that this actually is one of the most important points of, I think, your book, is in a primitive, overly simplistic, and in my view, totally inaccurate picture of the world. You have the progressives who want to do all of this stuff. And then on the other side of the conservatives, keeping them from doing it. And if the progressives just got 51% of that legislature, then like all of the good things would happen. But Yoni's point is like, look, what's keeping you from affordable housing in the big blue cities? Zoning laws, which, by the way, liberals love because they got in there and were like, "Look, don't do anything," and then the net impact is that housing values go up to the sky in various blue cities, and that makes people sad in ways. You had this very compelling example of the Obama administration trying to do big renewable power projects as a response to the 2008 collapse. It's like, okay, we have to spend a lot of money, so let's go build like a giant wind power line because this will be win-win-win. It'll help us green the grid. It'll get some money out there in the ground infrastructure, and then it doesn't happen. Not because the conservatives block it. There are actually some conservatives who are into it because it was going to be in their neck of the woods, but that it got blocked because there were enough people that could keep it from happening, like along the construction line. That now there are all of these points of objection that people can raise, and that these are not things that conservatives typically employ. It's quote unquote liberals who are dubious of government building or projects, and so they impede it. And so this is like progressive stopping government from actually achieving many big things.
Yeah, I mean, I think in certain cases, it's progressives who use these tools, these vetoes within the system to block things that they don't want happening in their neighborhood. Conservatives use the tools too. Like everybody uses the tools. The big shift here is that, a generation ago, 3 generations ago, we progressives thought the problem, the sort of the meta problem in American politics was that smart, publicly minded, wise people didn't have enough power to make decisions for the whole of us. Like we wanted like real experts who understood the big picture, who thought about all the competing priorities, who like were really well versed to be empowered to choose what we were going to do, where a highway was going to go, where a bridge was going to be built, how we were going to get power, how the power was going to be delivered. Like we had an image, progressives did, of like generally like white men in gray suits wearing sort of frowns and fedoras, and like they were the quote unquote establishment, and they were wise and smart, and they had, shown us the way out of the Great Depression, and they had beaten the Nazis, and they won the Second World War. And like in the 50s, like the solution to big public problems seemed to be in empowering those types to do more at their own behest. So like the establishment took all sorts of forms. In the world of foreign policy, it took the form of the Georgetown set, which was like sort of like a bunch of like investment bankers and rich old people, and they were like the wise men at the State Department, and they were going to fashion the Marshall Plan and do containment, and they had all sorts of ideas. We were going to empower them. Like, don't listen to what ordinary people think. Like, give the experts control. And the same notion applied in the world of infrastructure. Like, how are we going to string up wires? Who should get to control the utilities? It should be the Public Utilities Commission. Again, the establishment. And who should get to choose what housing went up? Like, there was this phrase that was prevalent during those days that you can't fight City Hall, which is but that didn't mean you couldn't unseat an incumbent mayor. Incumbent mayors were unseated all the time. The issue was that behind the mayor was the real power. It was generally older men who met in a, it's not exactly in the back of a saloon. It's like they met in like a boardroom. And they were the powerful people at the Chamber of Commerce and in the business community, and right, like the union leaders. And they were like, they made decisions. They were the power elite. And our thought was, as progressives, we're all better off if they are given more latitude to make the right decisions. And then we wake up in the 60s and the 70s and realize, oh man, these guys aren't necessarily so wise. They're not necessarily so publicly minded. They're making often bad decisions. They're making decisions that benefit them. They're setting us into a war that we can't win. They're raising whole parts of cities through urban renewal in ways that are terrible for poor people and people of color. They're polluting the environment with, inefficient generating plants. They're spraying pesticides on plants to help big ag in ways that cause birth defects. Like, there are all these things that the establishment has done poorly. And so our impulse as progressives switches from the Hamiltonian to the Jeffersonian impulse in the main. And we begin thinking to ourselves, we are going to put in new mechanisms so that ordinary people can say stop when these sort of dark establishment figures begin trying to impose their will. And so, exactly to the point that you just brought up, by the time Obama is president-elect and they're having a meeting in Chicago about, is there some way to get wind power in the upper Midwest into Chicago, where that wind power would be expended, like, even people on Obama's team are like, listen, Mr. President-elect, that's a great idea in theory, but like, the process of both erecting the wind farms and then building transmission lines that are going to cross all of these farms and suburbs and people who are not going to like the idea, and who, by the way, probably also won't benefit directly from the electricity, right? Because the electricity is going to Chicago and Milwaukee. Like those people are going to stand in the way. And so we need to look to different sorts of projects if we're going to get this recovery money out quickly. And so, like, the challenge here is not to say we need to go back to the old way where, like, grizzled, old,
self-interested build a thing
men,
if we want and, get out of the way.
Correct. And but we've now so overcorrected that in all these realms we've created the opportunities and the sort of the bureaucratic infrastructure that anyone who wants to say no, even to a good project, can get in the way.
Have you made a New Year's resolution that's related to eating healthier, being a little bit more fit, losing a little bit of weight? Well, have I got great news for you. Factor meals can help you actually achieve that goal. Imagine fully prepared meals sent to you fresh. I'm good at a lot of things, I will confess, but I'm really crappy at cooking. And Factor makes it so that you can have a completely delicious, awesome meal in the comfort of your own home that's healthy, it's good for you. You know when you eat something and you know it's healthy? That's the experience with Factor. When I ordered it, the Nona's Bolognese, the mustard chicken, they hit the spot. They're quick, they're convenient, they get the job done, and then some. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code FACTORPODCAST at factormeals.com/factorpodcast to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. yeah, there's a lot of frustration around the country that we can't seem to build. We can't um, seem to do a lot of things that it seemed like we could do a few generations ago. It's like when you go around the country and they talk about how great the Golden Gate Bridge is, and you just think, oh wow, like we tried to do that now, it would they contrast it with the California High Speed Rail project where conservatives mock it, and then you look at it and be like, oh yeah, I can see why you are mocking it, and then it puts progressives on the back foot because it's hard to defend a government that can't get various things done. I think you tell a story about repairing an ice rink in New York where they just couldn't get it done, and then they just gave it to a developer who got it done for a fraction of the cost because they got to hire, like hire the same team to do it, whereas the government had to break it up into multiple teams. And I think that developer's name was Donald Trump, which is like a very tough, like a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people. But like you do have this patchwork type of system, and people get frustrated by it, and then so you wind up thinking, how can you get back to government capacity? I think there's a passage in one of Yuval Noah Harari's books which really stuck with me. He said that everyone's concerned about someone else having too much power, someone else has too much power, when in reality, everyone's like, where did the power go? Like no one, like no one,
Correct.
no one can do the thing anymore because we've been trained, to your point, in this Jeffersonian impulse is like to fear the power, speak truth to power, like power is a bad thing. And so what we've done is we've kind of gutted government capacity, and then that is the liability that progressives are faced with politically now. Because if you're a conservative saying like, do you really trust the government to do that? Then progressives have to argue, yes, we do, even though they themselves the next day might might be expressing the opposite.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like the reason that New York City couldn't rebuild this rink was because a previous generation of progressive reformers had been worried that, like, the mayor of Schenectady might, create some bunk public works project and then give the contract to do the work to his brother-in-law, and it was an invitation to corruption. So they decided to make it so that government, when they were going to do big projects, were going to have to split up the electrical work, the concrete, the plumbing, et cetera, et cetera. Right? But it made it impossible for government to function. And so, exactly to your point, like what was Donald Trump's great insight in the mid 1980s was that even in a very liberal city like New York, liberal people were also pretty skeptical of government. So that he could be outrageous, but be effective in this case, or claim to be effective. He could run against the government without being necessarily like a small government conservative. He could say, I'm going to get you a better deal. And that would be politically appealing even in a liberal city, right? Like there's this terrific quote from, I think, a Joyce Pernick column at the time, like right after the Woolman rink is reopened, that Trump succeeds, where some ordinary New Yorker, like who you and I would presume would be an Obama Biden voter, right, or maybe even a Yang voter, right? But this guy says, whoever can get anything done in the city deserves a ticker tape parade, right? And like you can imagine Donald Trump reading that in Trump Tower, just like what, I don't know what he would do, but he would have liked to be ushered down the Canyon of Heroes and confetti, certainly at that time, and certainly probably at this time too. And like you're absolutely right. Like we have become so focused on screaming over and over at people who supported Trump, saying like this guy's a monster and he's a convict and he's a xenophobe and a racist and he's incompetent and he's a snake oil salesman and all. We've been attacking him without looking inside ourselves to see that we are conflicted against our own impulse to make government work. right? That we are simultaneously eager to build out this institution so that it can solve big problems like climate change, and dreadfully fearful that like powerful officials will do things that we personally don't like. And that sort of puts us in this strange position where we're selling refrigerators that don't keep the food cold, right? And then
Why
trying
are
to
you
figure out like
anti-refrigerator, Mark?
where the problem that we need is to create a refrigerator
Yeah,
that
that
works. Like
actually keeps the
the
food
problem
cold.
is the underlying problem is that the thing that we're selling is a thing that we are telling people doesn't work and doesn't work. And so rather than being focused on every Trump outrage, like this is a moment where we don't have any power. So we ought to spend it thinking about like let's get this right. Let's think about how are we going to create an agenda that would give the average voter the impression and the reality that once power is handed to a government official, they will be able to expeditiously solve some big public problem.
This podcast is sponsored by ExpressVPN. How did you choose which internet service provider to use? The sad thing is, most of us didn't have much of a choice because ISPs operate a lot like monopolies in the regions that they serve. They then use this monopoly position to take advantage of customers, and yes, they even sell your data, your activities to advertisers and big tech companies, and you don't see a dime. That's why I protect my internet surfing and devices with ExpressVPN. When you use ExpressVPN, it's like a magic portal to a perfectly safe and anonymous internet. And don't take my word for it. This is the #1 VPN service according to CNET. It's used by major companies all over the world. So stop handing over your personal data to ISPs and other tech companies who then mine your activity and sell off your information. Protect yourself with a VPN I trust to keep my privacy online. Visit expressvpn.com/yang. That's expressvpn.com/yang to get 3 extra months free. Go to expressvpn.com/yang right now to learn more. Yeah, and that leads to your recommendations and hope for the future, where you say, look, this is not a bad thing, because what this means is that if we can figure out what we are doing, both in terms of our anti power / government mindset, sometimes like the Jeffersonian impulse, like we start like approaching things a bit differently, and then actually maybe look at the rules and regulations that comprise the vetocracy. Like maybe we can change this. Like this is actually more within our power to change than perhaps changing the hearts and minds of millions of of areas on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you have this experience. Like when you talk to progressives today, they're sort of at week's end. They feel like they've spent the better part of a decade yelling and screaming about Trump, trying to get people to pay attention to the things that he's lied about, that he's wrong about, that that he doesn't actually care about the people that are voting for him in the working class. We've been so focused on that, and the sort of the notion is like, how many times do we have to tell people that he's bad until they believe us? As if we are powerless to do anything but post another example of Trump being duplicitous on Facebook or Twitter or whatever we're going to do. Like the sort of notion is like, I voted for the other guy. I'm going to keep telling the truth, but like until these people, begin to reality dawns on them, they're going to send our country into a tailspin. And what I'm saying here is like the upshot of my argument is that this is something that we can fix. Like we don't have to wait for Donald Trump. Like we, to the degree that we are our own impediment, we can solve this. Like there have been moments in progressivism's history where we've done amazing things, where we've had a really clear vision And we've accomplished incredible things, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which I think is the apotheosis of Hamiltonian progressivism. Like, here was an entire region of the country that was, 50, 100 years behind technologically. Like, there were poor farmers who couldn't get electricity to their farms, so they were farming in the manner of the 19th century here in the middle of the 20th. And the private companies, the utilities in the South, largely a company called Commonwealth and Southern, didn't believe that the return of wiring up these poor farms was going to be worth the expenditure that they would have to lay out. So they were leaving these people to live in poverty. And FDR and the people that he hired to run this authority said, no, like, if the market doesn't work here, we are going to fix it. And so they did. They dammed a bunch of rivers. They built these wires. They reforested, barren land. They created reservoirs. They created new industry. Like to the degree that the Upper South today is sort of, in keeping
Yeah.
with, that is something that we, the progressives, have done. There is no way that the progressivism of today, with its anti-government overlay, would ever seek to do anything so ambitious. And it wouldn't get done, even if Obama or Biden or anyone, even if they proposed it. Like, the system simply wouldn't allow it to get done. We need to focus on ourselves and create a place where government is capable of doing big things again: high-speed rail, transmission lines that take advantage of the clean energy revolution, new housing, et cetera, like, where we can make decisions fairly quickly, even when there are environmental objections, even when there are local objections, even when, like, someone is going to pay a heavy cost. Like, these are public goods. Like, we've got an asteroid, coming towards Earth, proverbially, in climate change. Like, if we're going to fix these problems, government needs to work, and that's something that we as progressives need to grapple with ourselves before we can continue to sort of, instead of being so exclusively focused on trying to convince people that the other side is the root of all evil.
I love it. That's a great message. No, there was a Twitter/X thread that made this argument and said, look, Democrats, if you want us to vote for you, all you have to do is make all of your blue cities incredible examples of prosperity and people living well, and not have homeless people or drug addicts on the street, and like have housing be affordable. Like, all you have to do is just make all of your blue cities awesome, and then we'll all come running and be like, oh, it turns out those guys were right. And I thought that was, like, that thread went viral, and I thought it was like, oh, it's a reasonable argument, because like, frankly, people are leaving both New York and California out of affordability concerns at the state level, and the numbers are very real. I mean, New York lost a member of Congress in part because of the population shift. Maybe it's because of my general approach, but it's like, you want to look inside yourself first. I think you've done a really, really powerful job of making this case, like, not in, like, it's like I mean, you document it and break it down in a way that, to me, is very, very inarguable. I think what you've made is a very valuable contribution to how progressives can think about making the changes that they want in real life, like, not in, like, like the social media battle of the day, but in our communities and neighborhoods.
I mean, the most remarkable thing to me in writing the book has been the degree to which it's so clear that we are vexed against ourselves, right? That if you were to go into a coffee shop in October of last year and asked a young voter, like, what are your two top voting issues? And they were to say climate change and reproductive rights. Like, you and I wouldn't have thought twice about that. That would seem
Sure,
totally
totally.
normal. But on our solution on the climate change things is clearly Hamiltonian, right? We want to instill in some bureaucracy the ability to tell carbon emitters to stop. And our concern on reproductive rights is clearly Jeffersonian, right? We don't want some bureaucrat telling some woman what she can do with her body. And so, like, it's just that, like, we would, with absent the sort of us thinking about it in the way that I'm trying to get my book to do, we don't see how those two things are in conflict. It doesn't mean that anyone who's pro-choice has to be against fighting climate, or that someone who's for fighting climate needs to be, throw reproductive rights outside, but we have to understand our own thinking if we're going to point our way outside of this box that seems to be allowing the populist MAGA wing of the American populace to wield a lot of influence.
Yeah, the way I've explained it, Mark, is I've said, look, you have like the pro-institution people and the anti-institution people, and the anti-institution people are winning. They've just got like had a better argument. They can just be like, hey, you're full of shit. This TV channel is full of shit. Like those people are full of it. And more Americans are like, oh yeah, like I'm down for that. And then the Democrats have become the de facto defenders of the institutions, but the institutions are faltering, and so it's like a losing argument. And so
Yes.
you need a different argument, either make the institutions work at a much higher level, maybe revamp them meaningfully, maybe modernize them meaningfully. But saying, hey, it's working is, not working, which is pretty much a reasonable summation of why nothing works, who killed progress, and how to bring it back. Congratulations, Mark. How can people catch up with you or keep up with you and your work?
I'm on all the regular socials, but really all of my wisdom has been poured into that book. So if any of these ideas are appealing, it's right there. You don't even have to click follow on X or anything like
You
that.
heard
It's
it
all
here
right there.
first. Mark would rather you buy and read his book than that you follow him on social media. Marc Dunkelman, Why Nothing Works. Congratulations, my friend. You really have made like a very, very big contribution. I know it was a lot of work, and I learned a lot. I mean, I consider myself pretty savvy, but I learned a lot from your book.
Thanks for having me on. This has been a great conversation.